So bones from a human can actually tell us a lot of things that, you can analyze them to figure out how old the person was when they died. Sometimes you can analyze them to figure out if the skeleton is from a male or a female. And then you can also analyze them to get small atoms from them that we call isotopes. And we use the isotopes from the bones to reconstruct diet. We as anthropologists think it's really interesting to understand diet and foodways. Because food is never just about eating the food. It's also about understanding political economy, or how we grow our food, or how we make cultural decisions about who to distribute the food to. All of these questions are tied to understanding humans and society. So this adage, you are what you eat, that actually applies really well in bioarchaeology, because the food that you eat gets incorporated into your bones and into your teeth. And so we can then analyze your bones and your teeth to figure out what foods you ate when you were a kid, or what foods you ate later on when you're an adult. But to do that, we have to get the stable isotopes from the bones. And that requires some really detailed work in the laboratory, where we use different chemicals, where we extract, for example, the collagen from the bone. And then we can analyze those with something called a mass spectrometer. And that allows us to figure out what kinds of foods people were eating 1,000 or 5,000 years ago. So one of the really interesting things with stable isotope analysis is we can tell if people ate corn or if they had corn beer. And in Peru, we call it chicha. And what we found is that the men had a lot more evidence of consuming more of this corn, or maybe even the corn beer. And this was seen perhaps as evidence that these men had access to these political feasts that women did not have access to. And so as a result of that, the men and the women had really different stable carbon isotope ratios. And that's meaningful to us because that tells us that men and women were engaged in some of these political feasting activities at different frequencies. So the stable isotope studies are also important for helping us understand much bigger questions about climate. So for example, I studied the Warrior Empire, and then the Warrior Empire collapsed. And the time that they collapsed, we have records that show that there was a drought. And so we were curious as to whether or not this drought caused any changes in agricultural production. So what the data showed is that everybody from the Warrior era had equal access and lots of access to corn. You go into the post-Warrior era, and the consumption of corn drops dramatically for everybody across the board. And what this suggests to us is that they could no longer produce as much corn as they used to. And this is probably related to the long-term drought that existed at the time. And then even though there was the drought, they were producing some corn, but not everybody got access to the corn. And so this is where we see differences emerge between men and women. So the little bit of corn that they did produce, more of the men got access to it relative to the women. So a lot of this research that I talk about is done with big groups of people, big teams of people where we collaborate. So I work with Peruvian archaeologists and American archaeologists and graduate students and undergraduates and even high school students. So I've had high school students work with me in my labs at Vanderbilt University, and they've even traveled with me to Peru to analyze some of these skeletal remains that we've excavated in Peru. So high school students have been really involved in this research, and we've written articles together, and they've been absolutely essential in a lot of this work that's been done.